I remember the first time the lights on the oil rig flickered just before the storm hit, and I felt something watching me from the shadows, something that shouldn't exist. They told me there were 11 rules I had to follow if I wanted to survive the night, but I ignored the first one almost immediately. Every flicker of the fluorescent lamps felt like a warning, each gust of wind carrying whispers I couldn't understand, and yet I kept moving, trying to convince myself it was just my imagination. Now as I hear the storm building again, I realize I might already be too late, and the first rule I broke is coming back to claim me. I remember the first time I truly understood Rule 1, never turn off the lights when the rig starts to flicker, though I didn't grasp its weight until that night on the offshore platform. The storm was already swelling on the horizon, black clouds rolling like angry waves, and the rig's fluorescent lamps had begun their uneven stutter, throwing the narrow corridors into a nightmare of shadows and sudden light. I could feel the metallic hum of the rig beneath my boots, a vibrating pulse that matched the pounding in my chest. Every flicker seemed deliberate, like some unseen presence was testing me, watching whether I had the courage or the stupidity to reach for the switches. My hand itched to turn them off just to see what would happen, but instinct froze me in place as the shadows stretched along the walls, coiling and twisting in ways that weren't physically possible. I whispered to myself, "Don't do it, don't do it," yet the curiosity was a heavy weight pressing against my ribcage. I wasn't alone. Mark, my colleague and the rig skeptic, walked ahead of me, laughing nervously as the lights sputtered around us. "It's just wiring," he said, flashing a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Stop overthinking. This rig has more old circuits than a haunted house." I wanted to argue, to convince him that something unnatural was slipping between the flickers, but the words caught in my throat. I could see it out of the corner of my eye, a shadow detaching itself from the walls, moving against the angle of the light, and retreating when I blinked. The hair on my arms stood on end, and I realized how fragile my sense of safety had been until that moment. Each light flicker was a heartbeat, and each heartbeat drew the darkness closer, closer than any storm could ever reach from the outside. As we moved toward the storage deck, the corridors seemed to narrow, the metal walls bending in on themselves under the rig's tremors. I tried to focus on the familiar, the smell of oil, the hum of generators, the sound of the ocean pounding the rig's supports. But even these constants felt distorted. The shadows weren't merely absences of light, they were shapes, alive and patient, stretching into corners that should have been empty. I muttered, "Mark, do you feel that?" He shook his head, still smiling through the tension. "You're seeing things, I swear." But I wasn't. I could feel their eyes on me. Each flicker was like a pulse of awareness from something that shouldn't exist here, in this sterile industrial place, surrounded by nothing but sea and wind. By the time we reached the stairwell leading to the upper decks, the storm had escalated into a screaming force. Rain lashed against the rig's metal skeleton, and lightning illuminated the horizon in blinding, strobe-like flashes that mimicked the flickering lamps inside. I kept my hand pressed against the wall, following the vibrations through the metal, feeling them as if the rig itself was trying to communicate. Shadows danced and twisted with each flicker of light, stretching across the floor and ceiling, bending at impossible angles, and I realized that even standing still didn't guarantee safety. "I think we should check the control room," Mark said, finally sounding uncertain. I nodded, but my mind was elsewhere, focused entirely on the dark shapes curling at the edges of my vision, growing bolder with each moment we delayed. When we reached the control room, the flickering had intensified, and the fluorescent tubes overhead pulsed like a living heartbeat. I could feel something brushing along the walls behind me, close enough that I thought it might reach out and touch my shoulder. I swallowed hard and whispered, "This is why we follow the rules." Mark frowned. "Rules? Seriously? It's just lights." But his voice wavered slightly, betraying the unease he tried to hide. I scanned the room, eyes darting from monitors to emergency lights, noticing that every flicker left a shadow where none had been before, shapes that coiled and shifted as if anticipating our moves. The rig's machinery groaned under the storm, but the sound of movement in the shadows was louder somehow, closer and impossibly deliberate. Mark moved toward a switch to stabilize the lights. "Just a flicker, we can fix this," he said, reaching out. My hand shot out to stop him, my voice urgent. "Don't touch it. Never turn off the lights when the rig starts to flicker." I barely managed to spit out the words before the lights plunged into darkness for a fraction of a second. In that instant, I felt the weight of the shadows pressing on me, the air thick and choking, the room shrinking around us. Mark froze, eyes wide, and I realized that whatever lurked in the dark wasn't a figment of my imagination. It was patient, precise, and now aware that we had nearly broken the first rule. The lights flickered back on, weak and trembling, revealing nothing but the rig and each other, but I knew that nothing had left the shadows. We moved cautiously through the control room, each step measured, every glance toward the dark corners, a test of nerve. I could feel the presence everywhere at once, brushing past my thoughts, nudging my fear, and I realized that Rule 1 wasn't about the lights. It was about recognition. The flickering lights were a line of defense, a fragile barrier that kept the rig from revealing the truth of what hid in the darkness. Mark finally spoke, voice low. "I think I saw something." His words trailed off, swallowed by the humming air. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The shadows had answered for him, curling along the walls like living ink, and I knew we weren't safe for a single step more. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. I couldn't tell. Every flicker made my pulse spike, and the rig felt alive in the worst possible way, groaning and vibrating, as if it shared the awareness of the shadows. Mark had stopped joking entirely, walking silently, eyes darting to every corner. The storm outside seemed to echo the tension inside, thunder rumbling like a heartbeat in sync with the lights. I tried to keep track of time, counting in my head, whispering reminders about the rule, but the shadows kept encroaching, subtle and persistent. Every time the lights dimmed even slightly, I could feel them brushing closer, waiting for the moment when the rule might be broken again. By the early hours, when the storm reached its peak, the rig was a maze of flickering lights and stretching shadows. I found myself retracing steps we had taken, checking doors, and confirming the lights were on. My mind kept returning to the near miss earlier, when Mark almost flipped the switch. If we had succeeded in turning off the lights, I shivered to think what would have followed. I could feel the dark shapes pressing, testing, circling, watching our every move. The weight of Rule 1 pressed down on me like the storm itself, relentless and unyielding, and I realized that even surviving this night might not be enough if the rule was ignored again. When the storm finally eased slightly, leaving only the low hum of wind and waves against the rig, I slumped against the wall. Mark avoided my gaze entirely, muttering about faulty wiring, but I knew better. The shadows had been patient, and Rule 1 had saved us for now. But I also knew that the night wasn't over, and the rules were only beginning to show their teeth. As I looked at the flickering lights, I couldn't shake the thought that somewhere, beyond the edges of vision, the darkness had already noticed us, and the next mistake might not allow us to survive. I had barely recovered from the ordeal of the flickering lights, when a soft, uneven sound reached my ears, and my stomach dropped. Rule 2. Never ignore the sound of footsteps behind you, even if no one is there, echoed in my mind. A warning I had hoped I'd never have to put to the test so soon. At first I thought it was Mark, moving cautiously after me, but when I turned slightly, he was far ahead, his silhouette swallowed by shadows, and the occasional strobing light. The steps were slow and deliberate, echoing unnaturally through the hollow metal corridors, each one reverberating in a way that made my teeth ache. My heartbeat thumped in my ears, matching the rhythm of the steps, and I felt an almost magnetic pull to glance directly behind me, a pull I fought desperately to resist. Mark, oblivious, or pretending to be, continued walking, muttering about the storm outside, and how the rig was just playing tricks on our minds. But I couldn't ignore the sound. It wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't human. It had a weight to it, a presence that shifted with the shadows. I whispered under my breath, trying to convince myself that it might be something mundane, but the irregularity of the steps, the tiny scraping of metal on metal, told a different story. My hand hovered near the railing, and I kept moving cautiously, forcing my gaze forward, while listening to the footsteps growing louder with every step we took toward the upper deck. I realized that the rig, which had felt almost safe under the light rule, had now become a corridor of anticipation, and each step behind me was an unwelcome question I didn't want to answer. As we reached the stairwell, the storm's fury pressed against the rig with a relentless roar. Rain slanted sideways, beating against the metal, and lightning illuminated the corridors in fleeting, harsh flashes. The footsteps behind me did not falter. They mirrored our pace, sometimes matching it, sometimes lagging just enough to make my nerves taut. I tried to speak to Mark, to get him to acknowledge what I was hearing, but the words stuck in my throat. "Do you hear that?" I finally managed to whisper. Mark didn't respond, either ignoring me or pretending not to hear, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his fingers gripped the railing like he was afraid of letting go. I knew then that the presence wasn't just behind me. It was learning, adapting, testing how far it could go before I reacted. The corridor narrowed as we continued, and the shadows cast by the flickering emergency lights warped unnaturally. Shapes I thought were ordinary shadows now seemed to have dimension, stretching along the walls in ways that defied the angles of the rig. The footsteps persisted, following, almost stalking us. Each step made the metal flooring vibrate lightly under my boots, but there was an unevenness, a hollow resonance that hinted at a presence above or below us as well. I swallowed hard, gripping the railing tighter, and tried to remember the other rules I hadn't yet learned. But in this moment, only Rule 2 mattered. Every instinct screamed that if we ignored the sound, if we acted like it wasn't there, we would pay dearly. I could feel the pressure building in the air, a suffocating, static-like energy that made my hair stand on end. Mark paused near a junction and glanced at me, a flicker of doubt crossing his normally confident expression. "It's just the storm, right?" he said, trying to force normalcy into his voice. I shook my head slowly, whispering, "No, something's behind us. Don't act like you don't hear it." But the steps didn't respond to my words. They were patient, deliberate, testing our awareness. I tried to ignore the rising panic and focused on counting my own steps, matching them rhythmically, forcing myself to stay grounded. But the echoes of the footsteps seemed to dance around my own cadence, mocking the effort. The further we went, the more pronounced the phenomenon became. I started noticing subtle differences in the shadows cast by the lights, corners where darkness seemed to pool, edges where the metal walls looked like they were bending slightly. Every flicker of light revealed a fraction of movement behind us that vanished as soon as I tried to focus on it. I told myself repeatedly that Rule 2 existed for a reason, that acknowledging the footsteps and respecting their warning was the only way to survive. My mind raced with questions. Were these echoes sentient? Were they some manifestation of the storm's energy? Or had the rig itself become a conduit for something older, something patient and cruel? Mark was growing visibly tense, whispering about the lights again, about the rig's old wiring, anything to rationalize what we were hearing. But rationalization did not protect us. The steps were deliberate, synchronized with our movement, but never fully predictable, slipping closer with every turn and pause. I could feel them in my chest, a pressure that made it difficult to breathe, a weight that pressed against my senses and made the corridor feel narrower than it physically was. Every time I turned slightly to glance backward, my vision caught only the end of a shadow, a bend in the hallway, or a flicker of something that disappeared before I could comprehend it. By the time we reached the observation deck, overlooking the churning, black ocean, the footsteps had become almost hypnotic in their rhythm. They weren't loud, not in a conventional sense, but they carried a weight, a presence that seemed to tug at the edges of my consciousness. I whispered to Mark again, almost pleading, "Do you understand now? This is why we never ignore them." He nodded slowly, pale and quiet, gripping my arm for balance against the rig's tremor and the wind. The storm outside was no longer just a backdrop. It was an accomplice, masking the sound of movement, hiding the shape that followed us relentlessly. The observation deck was small, and the railing trembled under our grip as the rig shuddered. I could feel the air thickening around me, almost viscous, making each inhale laborious. The footsteps were still there, now seeming to circle, to anticipate, to mock the futility of our escape. I realized then that ignoring them even for a moment would be catastrophic. Rule 2 wasn't a suggestion, it was a lifeline. I tried to memorize the subtle changes in their rhythm, to predict them, but the shapes and the shadows were too intelligent, too patient. It wasn't just following, it was hunting. Time blurred, the storm raged on, the rig groaning, lights flickering weakly, and the footsteps continued with inexorable consistency. I whispered my fears into the wind, spoke my warnings aloud to Mark, and tried to ground myself with the knowledge of the rule. The darkness pressed closer, shapes shifting at the edges of the lights, circling, testing, and I understood, with a clarity that chilled me to the bone, that Rule 2 was more than a precaution. It was a test of attention, awareness, and fear itself. Even now, as I leaned against the railing, ears straining to catch every shift, I could feel the steps drawing nearer, deliberate and patient, a constant reminder that the rig held more than storm and steel. Something unseen followed, waiting for even the smallest lapse, and I knew the night was far from over. Breaking Rule 2 wasn't an option. Acknowledging it, respecting it, surviving it, that was the only chance we had, and even that felt perilously thin. By the time we reached the narrow maintenance corridor, I could feel my nerves fraying, every fiber of my body on high alert. Rule 3. Never look directly at the shadows moving against the walls flashed in my mind like a warning flare, and I realized how easy it would be to ignore it in panic. How tempting it was to stare and try to make sense of what was happening. The shadows were subtle at first, nothing more than stretches of darkness flickering with the failing lights, but they moved independently of the rig structure, slithering along walls and floors with a fluidity that shouldn't exist. Mark followed close behind me, silent now, every step cautious, his eyes darting, but refusing to fix on the shifting darkness that writhed along the steel panels. I felt a pulse of fear that wasn't mine alone, as if the shadows could sense that I was aware of them, that my attention was their invitation. Every time the light stuttered, the shadows stretched longer, curling into shapes that looked almost human, almost alive. My breath hitched, and I tried to keep my eyes down, focused on the safety of the corridor floor, knowing that even a glance could draw their attention. I whispered to Mark, "Keep moving, don't look." He nodded, his jaw tight, but I could see the battle in his expression, the urge to look, to confront the impossible. Each flicker of light revealed more of the darkness, teasing details that my mind shouldn't perceive. The shadows didn't behave like reflections or distortions. They moved with intent, converging subtly, as if herding us towards some unseen purpose. My pulse raced, and the memory of Rule 2 footsteps behind us reminded me that acknowledging danger wasn't enough. We had to respect it without directly challenging it. The corridor ended at a junction leading to the control room, and I could feel the rig itself trembling under the storm's force. The wind outside roared, shaking the metal walls, but the shadows inside were relentless, moving independently, flowing toward me in a way that defied gravity. I had to force my gaze to the floor, counting my steps carefully, feeling the tension coil like a spring in my chest. Mark whispered, almost inaudibly, "It feels wrong, doesn't it?" I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The shadows were everywhere, and looking at them directly would have been suicide. I kept my eyes on the dimly lit flooring, aware that each flicker of light might reveal a new impossible configuration of darkness behind us. As we progressed, the shadows grew bolder. I could sense them stretching, pooling, branching in directions that made no sense. I imagined that if I glanced up, even for a moment, I would see forms, faces, limbs contorted impossibly, watching me. My mind tried to rationalize it, insisting it was the flickering lights, the storm, the exhaustion, but instinct screamed louder. I had survived Rule 1 and Rule 2 by following their warnings to the letter, and breaking this one now would undo everything. Every flicker became a heartbeat I had to synchronize with, a rhythm that kept me grounded while the darkness moved around me like a predator testing its prey. Mark's breathing grew uneven as we reached the machinery section, the hum of pumps and generators blending with the storm's distant roar. Shadows here were denser, thicker, coiling along pipes and equipment, and I felt the pull to glance directly at them. My body stiffened as if resisting some magnetic force. I whispered again, "Don't look, no matter what you see." Mark's head nodded once, his lips pressed together, but his eyes flickered toward the darkness involuntarily. A subtle shift in the shadows made me flinch, a curling tendril of black that seemed to sense his curiosity, brushing past his shoulder before snapping back into obscurity. I realized then that the shadows weren't just passive, they were aware, reacting to attention, rewarding or punishing it in ways I could barely comprehend. We pressed on, careful, slow, each step measured, eyes glued to safe surfaces, avoiding the unnatural dark shapes that slithered like liquid along the walls. I felt the corridor narrowing, not physically, but mentally. The shadows seemed to close in, a constant threat, their presence heavy and oppressive. Mark stumbled slightly, glancing up, and I grabbed his arm forcefully. "Don't look," I hissed. His eyes widened in terror, and I could feel his fear radiating into the air, thickening it, giving the shadows more power. They were feeding, or at least thriving, on acknowledgement, and I realized that restraint was our only weapon. The lights flickered again, briefly revealing the impossible shapes of shadow figures curling along the ceiling and walls, and I forced my gaze down, resisting every impulse to stare. Hours, or perhaps minutes, I couldn't tell, passed in tense, cautious silence. The rig's machinery groaned and hummed under the storm's pressure, but the shadows seemed unaffected, moving fluidly, as if time did not touch them. My mind raced with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Were these shadows remnants of previous workers, manifestations of fear, or something far older, far crueler, bound to the rig and thriving in the chaos? I whispered to Mark, "We have to remember the rules. One mistake, and it's over." He nodded silently, eyes fixed downward, steps synchronized with mine. The knowledge of Rule 3 was seared into my consciousness. Seeing them meant surrender, ignoring them meant survival. As we neared the central maintenance hub, the shadows grew more aggressive in movement, swirling in ways that seemed to anticipate us, reacting to our presence. Every flicker of light created new configurations, new shapes, each more unnatural than the last. I felt a pressure against my mind, a mental tug that almost forced me to look, and I clenched my jaw to resist. Mark stumbled again, muttering about exhaustion, about hallucinations, and I realized that the shadows preyed on weakness, on curiosity, on the tiniest lapses in attention. Survival depended on vigilance, focus, and a refusal to confront the incomprehensible directly. Finally, as the storm outside began to wane slightly, the rig felt marginally more stable, but the shadows remained, patient, waiting, coiled in corners, and along pipes like predators resting before a strike. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease just slightly, but I knew it was temporary. Rule 3 had been obeyed, yes, but the night was far from over, and each rule only led to the next, each more insidious, each demanding our absolute attention. I could feel the weight of what lay ahead pressing down, and I knew that the shadows were still watching, still learning, still waiting for a single mistake that might cost us everything. By the time we reached the lower decks, I was already on edge from surviving the previous rules. Rule 4. Never speak when you hear a voice calling your name in the shadows reverberated in my mind as a dire warning, and I realized with dread that this night was escalating far beyond anything I had imagined. The flickering lights of the rig cast elongated shadows along the narrow corridors, and in those shifting dark patches, I began to hear it, a soft, coaxing whisper of my name. At first, I thought it was my imagination, the storm outside playing tricks on my exhausted mind. But the voice was unmistakable, clear and chillingly close, echoing through the metal walls in a way that felt almost alive. I froze, gripping the railing tightly, every instinct screaming that responding, even mentally, could be catastrophic. Mark's footsteps slowed behind me, cautious, hesitant, and I realized he had also heard it. His breathing became shallow, uneven, as if he were trying to convince himself the voice was nothing, but I could feel the tension radiating from him, feeding the oppressive air that pressed against my chest. The shadows around us seemed to shift with the sound, curling and twisting as though they were the conduit for the voice, stretching toward us with subtle, insidious intent. I whispered sharply, "Don't say anything, no matter what." He nodded, pale and wide-eyed, and we moved forward in a tense, synchronized rhythm, our pace dictated by fear rather than strategy. Each flicker of light revealed shapes at the periphery of our vision, always shifting, never still, always suggesting movement toward us. The corridor twisted and narrowed, forcing us to move single file, our hands brushing against the cold steel walls as if clinging to reality itself. The whisper came again, clearer this time, and my name rolled over the metal, soft yet insistent, coaxing, inviting. I forced myself to keep my head down, counting my steps, focusing on the sound of my boots on the grated floor, rather than the voice itself. Mark whispered under his breath, "It can't be real. It has to be the storm." I shook my head minutely, knowing better. This was beyond reason. The voice wasn't outside or mechanical. It came from the shadows themselves. A lure, a trap, a test. Responding, even out loud, would be a mistake that could unravel everything we had survived so far. As we descended further into the lower decks, the hum of machinery became more pronounced, blending with the whisper in a disorienting symphony. The voice varied subtly with each flicker, sometimes soft and coaxing, sometimes sharp and commanding, as if it were studying us, learning our reactions, probing for weakness. I realized that the rig itself had become a stage, the shadows the performers, and we were the unwilling audience, forced to obey the unspoken rules, lest we be consumed by whatever lurked unseen. I clenched my fists, trying to steady my trembling, and reminded myself of Rule 4, repeating it in my mind to reinforce its importance. Never speak, never acknowledge, never give the voice any foothold in reality. Mark and I reached a junction where two maintenance tunnels converged, and the whispers intensified, now sounding almost like multiple voices, overlapping, echoing, filling the space with an eerie chorus. I felt the shadows pressing closer, pooling at the edges of my vision, extending into corners where light had failed to reach. My pulse hammered in my ears, and I fought the urge to respond, to yell, to call back, but I forced my tongue to stay still, my lips sealed, even as the voice morphed into a more insistent tone. Every instinct screamed that giving voice to fear would empower it, that acknowledging the shadows would make them bolder. We pressed on, careful, deliberate, keeping our movements synchronized, eyes forward, hands on the walls for grounding. The shadows slithered around us, dancing along pipes, curling along the edges of machinery, constantly moving in a way that made it impossible to predict. I noticed subtle changes in their shapes with each flicker of the lights, figures that seemed to lean toward us when we moved or paused, twisting impossibly to mirror our presence. The voice continued to whisper, now layering multiple tones, multiple inflections, as if it had learned how to mimic our own thoughts, drawing us into a dangerous psychological game. I realized that obeying Rule 4 wasn't just about silence. It was about resisting every mental lure, every primal instinct to respond, and surviving required absolute focus. Hours, or perhaps it was minutes, passed in tense, deliberate silence. The storm outside began to wane slightly, though the rig still groaned under its residual force. The shadows remained patient, circling, reacting to our presence, growing bolder with every subtle misstep. Mark's breathing grew shallow, uneven, but he didn't speak, and I silently praised his restraint, knowing that any slip of the tongue could trigger consequences we were not prepared to face. The whispers became softer at times, almost coaxing us into curiosity, almost tempting us to glance into the darkness, but I forced my gaze downward, focusing only on the flooring, the railings, the narrow path that kept us tethered to reality. At one point, The voice became maddeningly close, whispering my name directly into my ear, though no one was near. I felt a cold brush against my neck, subtle and fleeting, as if testing my resolve. I bit my lip until it bled slightly, refusing to respond, refusing to acknowledge its existence beyond the mental recitation of Rule 4. Mark trembled beside me, but I could see him resisting as well, and I knew our survival depended entirely on this restraint. Every flicker of light now seemed to mark a pulse in the shadows, a heartbeat for whatever entity was manipulating them, and I realized that the rig itself was not simply a place but a trap, a test, a proving ground. By the time we reached the maintenance hub on the lower deck, exhausted and shaking, the whispers began to fade, retreating with the rhythm of the lights and the weakening storm. The shadows remained, but they no longer pressed as closely, almost as if satisfied that we had survived this trial. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease, but I knew it was temporary. Rule 4 had been obeyed, yes, but the rig had more trials waiting, each more insidious than the last, each demanding unwavering attention. I could feel the oppressive presence of the shadows, patient and waiting, reminding me that the night was far from over, and that survival depended on obedience, restraint, and nerves of steel. The storm had finally settled into a low, relentless roar outside, but inside the rig, the air seemed to shift, thickening with an unnatural chill that made the hairs on my arms rise. Rule 5. Never enter a room that is colder than the rest of the rig reverberated in my mind as an urgent warning. I could feel the temperature dropping the moment we approached the maintenance hub's far corridor, the walls sweating frost, the steel floor beneath my boots growing icy to the touch. Each breath I took came out in tiny white clouds, visible against the dim emergency lights, and I realized with rising panic that this section of the rig was different, alien, oppressive, and dangerous. The shadows from Rule 3 had not left. Instead, they seemed to have concentrated in the corners, pooling with the cold, as if feeding off the temperature itself. Mark trailed behind me, shivering violently, muttering about broken HVAC systems, but I knew better. This wasn't a mere mechanical failure. It was deliberate. The shadows in the corners shifted when we stepped near, curling toward us like tendrils, reacting to the cold as if it were a beacon. I whispered urgently, "Mark, do not enter that room. Don't even think about it." He nodded, fear overtaking his skepticism entirely, and I could see his teeth chattering from both the cold and the tension. The room ahead radiated an unnatural presence. It seemed to suck the warmth and confidence from my body, leaving me hollow and vulnerable. Every instinct screamed that crossing that threshold would be catastrophic, but the shadows beckoned with subtle, impossible gestures that made the hair on my neck bristle. As we cautiously approached, I noticed the door itself was different. Metal, yes, but darker, almost blackened with age, or perhaps something far worse. The air around it shimmered slightly in the flickering lights, and I could feel my chest tighten as I measured the distance to safety. Mark's hand hovered near the handle, trembling, and I lunged forward, gripping his wrist. "Stop, Rule 5, I hissed, pressing my palm against the cold steel. The temperature seemed to intensify, biting into my skin, numbing my fingers instantly. The shadows along the walls seemed to pulse, curling outward as though they were alive and waiting for a single mistake. My throat went dry, and I swallowed nervously, realizing that our previous obedience to the rules had only delayed our confrontation with something far older and smarter than us. We stood there, listening. The storm outside had grown quiet, leaving only the hum of the rig's machinery and the subtle whisper of the shadows. I could feel them coiling closer, curling around corners and pipes, almost tangible, and every instinct in my body screamed to retreat. Mark's lips trembled, his usual sarcasm nowhere to be found, replaced with a raw, instinctual fear. I whispered again, repeating Rule 5 in my mind like a lifeline. Even the air seemed different here, heavier, saturated with a cold that carried intent. Each flicker of the lights overhead revealed tiny, subtle movements in the darkness, shadows that didn't behave like anything we had seen before, curling toward the cold room with patience and malice. As we edged along the corridor, I realized that the rig's familiar smells, the scent of oil, metal, and machinery, were replaced by a biting, sterile cold. It carried a sharpness that cut through my mind, clouding judgment and magnifying fear. I whispered warnings to Mark, who muttered something incoherent in response, and I realized he was on the verge of ignoring my advice entirely. The door loomed ahead, black and oppressive, exuding a quiet, malevolent intent. I felt the shadows pressing closer with every step, almost as if they were guiding us toward it, testing our restraint, testing how far we would go before breaking the rules. Mark's curiosity got the better of him. He glanced at the door, teeth clenched, and his hand twitched toward the handle. My heart nearly stopped. "Mark, don't," I shouted, gripping his shoulder with force, and for a moment, I swear the shadows recoiled, as if aware that a confrontation might be imminent. The temperature dropped further, a biting frost that seemed to pierce bone and sinew, and the shadows rippled, moving faster than I could track. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, visible in the freezing air, and I knew that entering this room would be like stepping into a predator's maw. The very concept of warmth, safety, and rationality felt like a distant memory here, replaced by an oppressive, predatory chill. We waited, frozen in place, the storm outside forgotten, the rig itself seeming to fade away, leaving only the corridor, the door, and the shadows. Each flicker of the lights overhead revealed impossible shapes, curling against the walls, moving closer, weaving into the darkness that seemed to radiate from the cold room. I could feel it in my chest, a tightness that made every heartbeat echo like a warning bell. I whispered again, softly, urgently, reinforcing Rule 5 in my mind. Survival wasn't just about following the rule, it was about resisting every instinct to investigate, to step forward, to satisfy the mind's curiosity. The shadows were patient, and the cold was their lure, drawing the unwary into a trap from which there might be no return. Time blurred. I could no longer tell if minutes or hours had passed, only that the oppressive cold continued to radiate from the door, and the shadows continued their silent, deliberate dance. Mark remained rigid beside me, eyes flicking toward the room, but refusing to engage fully. The rig's hum, the faint echo of distant machinery, the occasional flicker of light overhead, all became secondary to the presence that waited behind the door. I understood now that Rule 5 was more than a caution. It was a boundary, a line drawn in reality that we could not cross without paying a price. We couldn't survive. Finally, I stepped back slightly, pressing my hands against the cold steel of the railing along the corridor, grounding myself. Mark followed silently, still pale, still trembling. The shadows remained in the corners, patiently coiling, but they did not advance. For now, we had obeyed Rule 5, and the room remained untouched. But I knew that our journey through the rig's rules was far from over. The shadows waited, and the cold room loomed like a silent threat, a constant reminder that each misstep could unleash consequences far beyond comprehension. Even as we moved past it, the chill lingered in my bones, and I knew that the next rule would be even more insidious, building on the lessons of this one and the previous 4. The corridor beyond the cold room felt suffocating, the air thick with lingering frost, and the oppressive sense of unseen eyes watching our every step. Rule 6. Never touch any object that has fallen to the floor on its own pulsed in my mind as a warning sharper now than any before, because as soon as I thought of it, I saw the first sign, a small wrench lying in the center of the walkway, its metal glinting faintly under the flickering lights. I knew instinctively that it had not fallen accidentally. The rig was too still, the shadows too patient. Mark's eyes followed mine, his face pale, and I could see the same recognition dawning on him. Neither of us moved closer. The wrench seemed to pulse subtly in the flickering light, as if waiting for a hand to claim it, and I shivered at the thought of what might happen if we broke Rule 6. We continued down the narrow passage, every step careful, every glance calculated. The shadows from the previous rules were no longer passive. They moved around us with a deliberateness that was almost predatory. Shapes twisted along the walls, shifting with the dim lights, curling toward objects on the floor, as if to suggest temptation. I could see small items scattered ahead, a toolbox lid, a coil of rope, even a stray helmet, all lying in positions that felt deliberate, unnatural. Mark muttered under his breath, "It's just debris. Why are you freaking out?" I shook my head, gripping the railing, my pulse racing. "No, Mark, that's exactly why I'm freaking out. Rule 6 isn't just a suggestion. Do not touch them." The rig's hum grew louder, more insistent, almost like it was aware we were deliberating the fallen objects, testing our restraint. As we edged forward, I noticed subtle movements in the shadows. The wrench we passed earlier seemed to twitch, almost imperceptibly, as if nudged by some unseen hand. I swallowed hard, trying to convince myself it was a trick of light, a quirk of the rig's instability, but deep down I knew it was more than that. Every object that lay in our path was a test, a potential trap designed to exploit curiosity, impatience, or fear. I could feel the shadows reacting to our focus on the fallen items, curling and stretching with anticipation. Mark's fingers itched toward one of the objects, a rusted bolt, but I grabbed his wrist sharply, whispering, "Don't even think about it. Rule 6, it's for a reason." His eyes widened, and he nodded quickly, but I could sense the internal struggle as the rig seemed to pulse around us, pressing the temptation closer. The storm outside had softened to a dull roar, but inside, the rig's machinery seemed to resonate with the malevolence of the shadows. Every flicker of light created new shapes on the walls, some suggesting motion, others suggesting faces, watching us, anticipating our failures. The corridor itself seemed to elongate unnaturally, each fallen object placed to make the passage feel endless, a gauntlet of restraint. I could feel my hands trembling, my pulse accelerating with each step as I forced myself not to look at the objects too closely. The shadows seemed to react, twisting more aggressively, and I realized that any slip, any thought of touching one of them, could unleash consequences that went beyond imagination. Mark stumbled slightly, his foot brushing against a stray screwdriver lying in the path. He froze instantly, eyes wide, glancing at me as if to ask permission to pick it up. I gritted my teeth and whispered, "No, don't touch it. Don't even move it. Rule 6 exists for a reason." He nodded, and we waited a tense moment, listening as the shadows seemed to settle, curling around the edges of the objects, patient but alive. I realized that the rig itself had become an elaborate test of restraint, each fallen item a lure, each shadow a guardian, ensuring the rule was obeyed. I forced my breathing to slow, counting steps carefully, forcing focus outward rather than inward, trying to ignore the irresistible temptation the objects radiated. We reached a wider maintenance bay, and the number of fallen objects increased exponentially. Coils of cable, scattered wrenches, panels, even a clipboard that had toppled in a way that suggested intention. The shadows here were denser, almost tangible, pressing in from every corner, following our movements with a quiet, deliberate patience. I felt the temperature drop slightly as we advanced, the air growing heavier with each step. Mark's shoulders tensed visibly, and I knew he was fighting his curiosity, the temptation to bend the rules just once. I whispered firmly, "Do not touch anything, not one thing." Rule 6, he swallowed, nodding, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The rig seemed to respond to our obedience, the shadows subtly relaxing their pressure, though still pulsing with silent menace. Suddenly, a panel in the corner shifted slightly, as if pushed by something unseen. I felt a surge of dread, my instincts screaming to move away immediately. The shadows pulsed in response, circling the fallen panel as though it were the most important object in the room. I could feel the temptation pressing against my mind, subtle yet insistent, whispering possibilities, testing our restraint. I gritted my teeth, forcing my gaze downward, and moving cautiously past it. Mark followed suit, silent, determined. Each step forward felt like a victory, but also like a test. The rig and its shadows seemed aware that we were surviving by the narrowest margin, every choice under scrutiny. Hours, or maybe it was minutes, I could no longer tell, passed as we navigated the bay, avoiding every fallen object with painstaking care. The shadows seemed to ripple around us, subtly adjusting to our movements, their presence a constant reminder of the consequences of disobedience. I whispered reminders of Rule 6 under my breath, not to Mark, but to myself, reinforcing the importance of restraint. Every flicker of light, every hum of the machinery, every subtle movement in the shadows heightened the tension, making the task feel almost unbearable. I realized that survival here wasn't just about following rules, it was about resisting instinct, suppressing fear, and ignoring the primal lure of curiosity. Finally, we reached the end of the maintenance bay, and the shadows seemed to pull back slightly, almost as if satisfied that we had passed the gauntlet. The fallen objects remained in place, ominous and untouched, a reminder of what could have happened if we had faltered. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, but I knew it was only temporary. Rule 6 had been obeyed, yes, but the rig still held many more tests, each more insidious than the last. The shadows lingered, patient and waiting, a silent promise that the next challenge was already ahead, ready to punish the slightest lapse in judgment. The narrow corridor ahead was dimly lit, the emergency lights flickering weakly, and my nerves were already frayed from the trials of the previous rules. Rule 7. Never turn your back on a door that closes by itself, pressed into my mind as an urgent warning. A rule that suddenly felt more dangerous than any of the others we had survived. As we rounded a corner, I noticed one of the heavy steel doors at the end of the hall slowly swinging shut on its own. The movement was deliberate, silent, except for the faint metallic scrape that echoed along the walls. Mark instinctively slowed, his eyes locked on the door, and I felt a pulse of fear slam into me like icy water. I forced myself to stop, gripping the railing, every muscle tense, knowing that turning my back, even to continue down the corridor, could be catastrophic. The air around the closing door was thick, almost viscous, and I could feel the oppressive weight of unseen eyes pressing in. Shadows pooled at the edges of the corridor, curling like smoke, seemingly drawn toward the movement of the door. I whispered to Mark, "Do not turn around. Keep your eyes forward. Rule 7 exists for a reason." He nodded, his face pale, his lips pressed tightly together as he followed my lead. The door continued to close, slowly, deliberately, almost testing our resolve, and I could feel a subtle vibration in the floor beneath us, as if the rig itself was reacting to our compliance, or threatening punishment if we failed. Every instinct screamed to look back, to check if the threshold concealed some monstrous shape, some waiting entity, but I forced my gaze forward, counting steps carefully to anchor myself. As we moved cautiously past the door, I could hear the faint echo of its latch engaging, a low metallic click that resonated through the corridor. The shadows along the walls seemed to react, rippling outward, coiling and stretching, as if they had been tethered to the door itself. The temperature dropped slightly, the cold biting at my skin and amplifying the fear already gnawing at my mind. I whispered under my breath, reminding myself of Rule 7, repeating it like a mantra, forcing awareness to stay sharp. Mark stumbled slightly, but didn't turn, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain control, to resist the compulsion that the rig and its shadows were exerting over us. The corridor narrowed further, forcing us into a single file, each of us wary of the smallest sound, the faintest flicker of light. The rig groaned and trembled under the residual force of the storm outside, and I realized the environment itself seemed alive, amplifying our fear and testing our obedience. The shadows along the walls now seemed more aggressive, moving subtly in response to our movements, coiling around corners, stretching toward us in a way that suggested awareness. I forced myself to breathe steadily, counting each step, refusing to glance backward, even as the metallic echo of the door's closure lingered in my ears. Every instinct screamed that looking back would give the shadows and the rig the advantage. Mark whispered quietly, almost inaudibly, "Do you think it's watching?" I didn't respond, knowing that acknowledging it might provoke consequences. The corridor ahead was long, dark, and filled with more doors, some closed, some slightly ajar, each one carrying the same oppressive presence. The shadows seemed to pulse in time with our heartbeats, following our progress, testing whether our focus would waver. I realized that Rule 7 wasn't just about doors, it was about discipline, attention, and the restraint necessary to navigate the rig safely. One glance, one moment of curiosity, and the consequences could be immediate and severe. A sudden chill swept down the corridor, and one of the adjacent doors began to creak, as if pushed by an unseen hand. My stomach turned, and I felt the magnetic pull of fear urging me to turn. I tightened my jaw, gripping the railing, and forced my gaze forward. Mark's hand brushed against mine, trembling slightly, and I could feel his tension radiating through him. The shadows reacted instantly, stretching and curling, almost taunting, but neither of us turned. Each flicker of the emergency lights created shifting patterns on the walls, some suggesting impossible shapes, some suggesting movement that our minds couldn't fully process. Yet I forced my attention forward, counting steps, keeping my body anchored to the present moment. The rig groaned and shifted, as if protesting our refusal to comply with curiosity. Doors along the corridor seemed to breathe, subtly moving in rhythm with the shadows that clung to their frames. I could feel the oppressive weight pressing in from all sides, a reminder that the environment was actively testing us. My pulse raced, and I whispered Rule 7 to myself again, reinforcing its importance. Mark's eyes flicked once toward a closing door behind us, and I grabbed his arm sharply. "Don't, not even a glance," I hissed. His face paled, and he nodded immediately, understanding that one lapse could undo everything we had endured so far. As we advanced, the corridor opened slightly into a small chamber filled with machinery, pipes, and panels, all casting shadows that moved with a life of their own. One of the doors near the center of the room began to close slowly, deliberately, and I felt the familiar magnetic pull of fear urging me to turn. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing against the metal walls. I forced myself to breathe deeply, counting the steps of my boots against the grated floor, and I felt a subtle shift in the shadows around us. They recoiled slightly, almost impressed by our obedience. I realized that Rule 7 was not simply a rule of caution. It was a measure of our ability to maintain control over our primal instincts, to resist the urge to confront what we feared most. The shadows remained patient, curling in corners, pooling near doors, their shapes stretching impossibly, as if testing our perception. I forced my gaze forward, focusing on the faint glow of emergency lights ahead. Mark followed closely, silent and tense, his usual bravado completely absent. Every flicker of light, every subtle metallic groan, seemed amplified, designed to provoke instinctive reactions. I understood then that the rig itself had become a living gauntlet. Each door, each shadow, each flicker of light, a test of obedience and self-control. Survival depended entirely on respecting the rules, on suppressing curiosity and fear, and on moving through the corridors with absolute vigilance. By the time we reached the end of the chamber, the door that had closed behind us now stood completely shut, silent and still, its presence a reminder of what we had avoided. The shadows lingered, patient and coiled, their intent inscrutable, their forms still impossible to comprehend fully. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease slightly, but I knew it was only temporary. Rule 7 had been obeyed, yes, but the rig still held countless dangers, each more insidious than the last, each demanding absolute attention. I could feel the pressure of what lay ahead, the knowledge that the next rule would challenge us in ways far beyond what we had endured so far, and I knew the night was far from over. The corridor opened into a maintenance chamber bathed in the dim glow of failing overhead lights, and immediately, I felt a strange, unsettling rhythm in the flashes. Rule 8. Never stay in a room where the lights flicker in a pattern you don't recognize surged in my mind as an urgent warning, the kind that made my skin crawl instantly. The lights pulsed unpredictably, sometimes strobing quickly, sometimes fading into long, uneven pauses, casting shadows that danced and twisted unnaturally. Mark hesitated at the threshold, his eyes narrowing as he tried to decipher the pattern, curiosity warring with fear. I gripped his arm firmly and whispered, "We can't stay. Rule 8, we move. Now." The shadows responded instantly, stretching along the walls, pooling in corners, as if the flickering light had awakened them, giving them awareness. As we stepped inside cautiously, the room seemed alive with tension, every object and shadow vibrating with subtle intent. The flickering lights created impossible angles, making machinery look twisted, walls stretch, and shadows bend in ways that defied physics. I could feel the rig itself pressing down on me, a suffocating weight amplified by the unnatural strobe of illumination. Mark's breathing became shallow, and I knew he was struggling to resist the temptation to pause, to observe the pattern longer, to understand it. But understanding here would be dangerous. The flickers were a lure, a test, a weapon designed to unravel us if we lingered too long. I whispered again, "Do not stay. Rule 8 exists for a reason." The longer we remained, the more pronounced the instability became. Shadows detached from objects, stretching across the floor and ceiling, moving in ways that mirrored the erratic flashes. I could feel the air thicken, a pressure building in my chest, making each breath shallow and labored. Mark stumbled, and I caught him by the shoulder, forcing him to continue moving. "Don't freeze. Don't try to study it," I urged, my own voice trembling. Every flicker seemed to suggest shapes, faces, figures, impossible forms lurking just beyond perception, teasing us with glimpses of something we weren't meant to comprehend. Rule 8 wasn't just about lights. It was about control, perception, and survival. One pause, one glance too long, could give whatever was in the shadows the advantage. The room was deceptively large, filled with machinery and scattered tools, each piece casting strange silhouettes under the irregular strobe. I could feel a pull in my mind, a subtle hypnotic rhythm in the flickering pattern, urging me to pause, to watch, to analyze. But I forced my gaze downward, counting steps carefully, focusing only on the floor beneath my boots. Mark followed closely, silent and tense, his eyes fixed ahead. The shadows pulsed in response to the light's erratic rhythm, curling and twisting with awareness, almost alive in their intent. I realized that the flickering pattern wasn't random. It was communicating, probing, feeding off hesitation and fear, and obeying Rule 8 was the only shield between us and catastrophe. As we navigated the chamber, a sudden rapid strobe caught my attention, illuminating a corner where shadows coalesced unnaturally. I could feel the temperature drop, the air itself seeming heavier, as if the room were compressing around us. Mark froze for a split second, mesmerized, and I grabbed his arm with force. "Move, now. Rule 8, I hissed. He nodded immediately, stepping forward, his boots scraping against the metal floor in a way that echoed ominously. The shadows reacted instantly, stretching toward the strobe, as if testing whether our attention had faltered. I felt my chest tighten, adrenaline flooding my system, knowing that disobedience here could be fatal. The room narrowed toward a maintenance hatch, the flickering lights creating optical illusions that made the walls appear to bend and pulse. Every flicker seemed longer than it actually was, dragging shadows in slow, impossible movements across the room. I had to fight the urge to glance toward each pattern, to try to decode it, to analyze it for some sense of logic. But logic didn't apply here, only obedience. The shadows responded to hesitation, reacting to every thought we couldn't control, and I could feel the rig itself watching, waiting to punish curiosity. I whispered softly, reinforcing Rule 8 in my mind, repeating it like a lifeline to anchor my awareness in reality. Mark stumbled again, this time nearly colliding with a piece of machinery. I grabbed him, pulling him past it, our bodies tense and rigid. The shadows in the corners shifted with impossible precision, stretching across the floor, skimming along walls, circling us as if testing our resolve. The flickering lights accelerated briefly, then slowed, their rhythm unpredictable and hypnotic. I forced my steps forward, counting, focusing on the path, keeping my mind occupied with survival rather than analysis. Rule 8 was survival itself. It wasn't just guidance. It was the difference between life and a descent into something incomprehensible. The deeper we moved through the chamber, the more oppressive the flickers became. Shadows coalesced in shapes that seemed to anticipate our movements, curving in ways that defied geometry, almost as if they were sentient. The irregular strobe amplified every sense, making the room feel larger, smaller, and simultaneously claustrophobic. I felt my throat tighten, every breath shallow and forced, as the rig seemed to pulse beneath my feet, the metallic groans and hums blending with the flickering rhythm. I whispered again, reinforcing Rule 8, willing Mark to obey silently beside me. The shadows responded subtly, curling and stretching, testing the limits of our restraint, and I realized that this was more than a test. It was a lesson in absolute obedience. Finally, we reached the far exit of the chamber, where the lights flickered more predictably. The oppressive energy lessened slightly, and the shadows, though still present, seemed to retreat into the corners, patient but aware. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my muscles ease just a fraction, but I knew the relief was temporary. The rig had more trials ahead, each building on the last, each more insidious, each demanding obedience, focus, and absolute attention. Rule 8 had been obeyed, yes, but the flickering patterns, the shadows, and the rig itself reminded me that the night was far from over, and the next rule would be waiting, ready to challenge us in ways we couldn't yet imagine. The flickering emergency lights from the previous chamber faded behind us, but ahead, in a narrow passage leading toward the control deck, a faint glow appeared, unnaturally suspended in the air, with no apparent source. Rule 9. Never follow a light that appears where there should be none flashed in my mind, as a stark warning, making my heart pound in my chest. The glow pulsated softly, casting strange reflections on the metal walls, almost like a lure designed to draw me closer. Mark stopped abruptly, his eyes widening, and I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he was tempted to move toward it. I grabbed his arm firmly. Do not follow it. Rule 9. Keep moving past it, not toward it. The shadows reacted immediately, curling from the corners as if aware that our attention had shifted, testing our resolve. The passage was narrow, forcing us to move single file, and the glow seemed to drift subtly, as if mocking our obedience, teasing the edges of our vision. My mind screamed to look away, to focus solely on the safe path forward, but the light was hypnotic, flickering in patterns that suggested movement and life. Mark's breathing became shallow, his fingers twitching toward it involuntarily. I whispered sharply, "Do not follow it, Mark. You'll regret it." His head snapped toward me, and he swallowed hard, nodding, though I could feel his body quivering with the urge to ignore my warning. The shadows stretched closer to the glow, reacting like predators circling their prey, patient but deliberate in their silent threat. Every instinct screamed that following the light could be deadly. It wasn't part of the rig, not part of the electrical system, not part of reality as I understood it. It hovered, flickered, and pulsed as if alive, coaxing curiosity, tempting the mind to engage. I felt the shadows around us intensify, extending along walls and floor, reacting to our awareness of the light rather than our movement. Mark stumbled slightly, caught between the instinct to flee and the temptation to investigate. I gritted my teeth and forced myself to focus forward, counting my steps carefully, whispering Rule 9 in my mind as a protective mantra. The rig seemed to pulse with malevolence, reinforcing the rule's importance in a way that no previous lesson had. The corridor widened slightly, allowing the glow to appear larger, brighter, almost tangible. It swirled lazily, teasing us, dancing along the metal surfaces with an intelligence that defied explanation. I could feel my chest tightening, a cold dread pooling in my stomach. Shadows on the walls reacted instantly, stretching in impossible angles, curling as though feeding off our attention. Mark's hand twitched toward the glow, almost brushing it, and I slammed my hand over his wrist. Do not, Rule 9, do not follow it. His eyes widened in panic, and he pulled his hand back immediately, but I could sense the battle raging in his mind. The glow pulsed more aggressively, as if sensing weakness, as if the shadows had instructed it to test us. We pressed forward cautiously, refusing to glance toward the hovering light, focusing only on the path ahead. Every flicker, every pulse of the glow seemed synchronized with the shadows, as though the rig had orchestrated a trap, a test of discipline and restraint. The air around us thickened, heavy and oppressive, pressing on our lungs and tightening our chests. I forced my focus on the safe passage beneath my feet, counting each step, reminding myself repeatedly of Rule 9, willing Mark to do the same. The glow flickered faster, pulses blending into a hypnotic rhythm that threatened to make me turn, to follow it against my better judgment. But I resisted, my survival instincts overriding curiosity, forcing each foot forward, despite the magnetic pull of the light. The shadows grew bolder as we advanced, stretching across the corridor, coiling along the walls, almost taunting us. The glow appeared to drift alongside, but I forced myself not to acknowledge it, pretending it didn't exist, even as its presence dominated my peripheral vision. The air grew colder, carrying an almost metallic scent, a tangible reminder of the unseen danger. I whispered again, softly, reinforcing Rule 9 in my mind, a mental lifeline as I guided Mark through the passage. The rig seemed to pulse around us, machinery humming in rhythm with the glow, amplifying the oppressive weight of its presence, testing our obedience and resolve with every careful step. Mark stumbled near a pile of scattered tools, the glow flickering directly over them, casting elongated shadows that twisted and moved like living forms. I grabbed his arm instantly, forcing him past without looking. Do not follow it, do not even think about it, I hissed. The shadows reacted immediately, stretching toward the glow and then recoiling, as if disappointed that we had not succumbed. I could feel the tension tightening in my chest, the oppressive weight of the rig pressing down on us, a reminder that obedience was the only thing keeping us alive. The glow pulsed more aggressively, and I realized it was learning, adjusting its behavior, becoming more insistent, more manipulative, testing the limits of human restraint. Finally, we reached the junction leading to the next corridor, the glow hovering behind us, pulsating like a heartbeat. We didn't stop, didn't glance back, forcing ourselves forward with trembling limbs. The shadows receded slightly, coiling in the corners, patient but watchful, almost as if acknowledging our compliance. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my shoulders ease, but only slightly, knowing the rig had more tests ahead. Rule 9 had been obeyed, yes, but the glow, the shadows, and the oppressive presence of the rig reminded me that survival was only temporary, and the next challenge would demand even more vigilance, restraint, and unwavering attention. The next corridor led us to a storage area that looked harmless, at first stacked with crates and barrels, the dim emergency lights casting long, uneven shadows. Rule 10. Never enter a room where the temperature suddenly drops, even if it seems empty, flashed in my mind as I approached, a warning sharper than any I had faced before. The moment I stepped through the threshold, the temperature plummeted, a cold that felt unnatural and aggressive, cutting through my clothes and sinking deep into my bones. Mark froze beside me, shivering violently, his breath coming out in small white clouds, and I knew immediately that we were in danger. The room seemed empty, yet the shadows clung to the corners, pulsating in ways that suggested intent, and the air itself seemed to hum with something alive. Every step I took was a battle against the freezing cold, my boots scraping against the metal floor with a dull, echoing thud. The crates along the walls seemed to twist slightly in the flickering light, casting shadows that moved independently of any logical source. I could feel the oppressive weight of the room pressing against me, An instinct screamed that this was no ordinary temperature drop. The cold was alive, malevolent, and I repeated Rule 10 in my mind as a mantra to keep my focus sharp. Mark's teeth chattered uncontrollably, and I grabbed his arm, urging him forward. Keep moving. Do not stop. Rule 10 is why we're still alive. The shadows reacted instantly, stretching along the walls and pooling near the corners, as if feeding off our fear and testing our restraint. I forced myself to ignore the natural human urge to seek warmth, to touch the walls or crates for grounding. The shadows moved with a deliberate predatory awareness, coiling closer whenever we paused, reacting to hesitation like a predator sensing weakness. The temperature seemed to fluctuate with our heartbeat, dropping sharply whenever my fear rose, almost as if the room itself was alive and aware of our presence. I whispered to Mark, "Don't even think about touching anything. Keep moving. Rule 10 is the only thing keeping us alive." He nodded, though his eyes flicked nervously to the darkest corners, where shadows bent impossibly, forming shapes that I couldn't fully comprehend. The room stretched on, deceptively long, filled with crates, barrels, and maintenance equipment, all casting shifting, impossible shadows in the flickering lights. Every instinct screamed that the cold was more than physical. It was psychological, a trap designed to weaken resolve and provoke mistakes. I could feel my muscles stiffening, my chest tightening, and every breath seemed to crystallize in the frigid air. The shadows moved with subtle intelligence, curling around crates, extending along the floor, creating a maze of menace that mirrored our steps. I forced myself to repeat Rule 10 silently, a lifeline against the terror creeping into my mind, urging Mark forward with each careful, deliberate step. Suddenly, a crate near the center of the room shifted slightly, scraping against the floor with a soft, metallic sound. My pulse jumped, and I instinctively reached for Mark, pulling him back. The shadows recoiled briefly, then stretched toward the movement, curling and twisting as if alive. The temperature dropped further, biting into my skin, numbing my fingers and toes almost instantly. I whispered sharply, "Do not investigate it. Do not stop. Keep moving." Rule 10. Mark's lips trembled, but he obeyed, following my lead, his eyes wide with terror. The shadows reacted again, coiling and stretching, probing, testing our restraint, almost like they were waiting for a single misstep. The room seemed to elongate, stretching beyond its physical boundaries, each flicker of the lights creating impossible perspectives, bending the walls and floor into shapes that disoriented the mind. The shadows moved independently of any logical source, pooling in corners, extending along the crates, reacting instantly to our presence. I could feel the cold intensifying, pressing down on my lungs, and I forced myself to focus on my steps, counting each one, ignoring the hypnotic pull of the shadows. Mark stumbled slightly, and I grabbed his arm with force, guiding him forward. "Do not stop. Keep moving." Rule 10, I whispered again, reinforcing the rule in both our minds. A sudden gust of icy air swept through the room, as if the rig itself exhaled a breath of malice. Crates rattled, shadows flickered violently, and the temperature plunged further, numbing our skin and slowing our movements. I forced my heart rate down, counting carefully, focusing on the path ahead, using Rule 10 as a mental anchor against the panic that threatened to overwhelm me. Mark followed silently, his usual skepticism gone, replaced by raw, primal fear. The shadows in the corners seemed almost impatient, curling toward us with deliberate intent, testing our resolve, our ability to obey the rule under extreme pressure. Time lost meaning as we navigated the room, each step forward a struggle against the cold and the oppressive presence of the shadows. Every flicker of the lights distorted perception, stretching and twisting the shadows into impossible forms that suggested movement, life, and intent. The temperature seemed tied to our fear, dropping sharply with every heartbeat, and I realized that the rig itself was alive, using environmental extremes to manipulate, to test, to punish. I whispered Rule 10 to myself repeatedly, a mantra of survival, forcing Mark to do the same, each repetition reinforcing our restraint and focus. Finally, we reached the far end of the room, where the shadows seemed to recoil slightly, retreating into corners as if acknowledging our obedience. The temperature, though still cold, stabilized marginally, allowing us to breathe more freely. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension in my chest ease slightly, but I knew that this was only temporary. Rule 10 had been obeyed, yes, but the rig still held more dangers, more tests, each more insidious than the last. The shadows lingered, patient and aware, a reminder that the next challenge would demand even more vigilance, focus, and unrelenting obedience. The cold room finally released us into the main operations corridor, and that was when the entire rig began to shake with a violent force that rattled my teeth and blurred my vision. Rule 11. When the storm reaches its loudest point, turn off every light and do not move until it ends surfaced in my mind as the ultimate warning, heavier than all the others combined. The wind outside howled through the metal like something alive, slamming against the structure with relentless pressure, and every overhead light flickered wildly. Mark looked at me, panic written across his face, as alarms began to pulse faintly in the distance, and I realized the storm had finally reached the phase we had been dreading all night. The corridor lights flashed brighter and brighter, as if trying to stay alive, and the shadows around us stretched unnaturally, filling every corner with restless movement. The rig groaned under the pressure, metal bending and flexing in ways it was never meant to, and I felt the vibration travel straight through my bones. Mark opened his mouth to speak, but his voice was swallowed by the roar of the storm pressing in from all sides. I grabbed his jacket and pulled him toward the nearest control panel, my heart racing as the lights overhead began to flicker in rapid, chaotic bursts that made the world feel unstable. The moment my fingers hit the switches, the corridor plunged into darkness, and the silence inside was worse than the noise outside. The storm still screamed beyond the walls, but inside everything felt thick and watchful, like the rig itself was holding its breath. I froze in place, every muscle locked, afraid that even the smallest movement would draw attention to us. Mark stood inches away from me, and I could feel his panic through the air, his breathing shallow and uneven, as the darkness wrapped around us completely. In the absence of light, the shadows no longer clung to walls or corners. They felt like they were everywhere at once. The floor beneath my boots felt different, softer somehow, as if the metal had lost its solidity. My mind raced with images of what might be standing just beyond my reach, but I forced myself to remain perfectly still. The storm outside intensified, waves crashing against the rig with enough force to make the entire structure sway, and each violent impact felt like a countdown towards something inevitable. Mark shifted slightly beside me, barely more than a twitch, and my heart nearly stopped. I reached out blindly and gripped his arm, squeezing hard to remind him without a single word that movement was dangerous. His body went rigid instantly, and I felt him nod in the darkness, even though I couldn't see it. The air felt colder again, not the biting cold from before, but something deeper and heavier, as if the darkness itself carried weight. Time stretched in ways that didn't make sense, seconds feeling like minutes, minutes like hours, as the storm continued to rage outside. The rig screamed and groaned, metal protesting under forces it was never built to withstand. Somewhere deep within the structure, something shifted with slow, deliberate intent, not caused by the storm but responding to it. I held my breath, every sense straining in the darkness, terrified that whatever was moving could sense fear as easily as sound. The pressure in my chest grew unbearable, and my legs trembled from the effort of staying perfectly still. The darkness felt closer now, pressing in, as if the absence of light had invited something to step closer to us. I could feel Mark shaking beside me, his fear mirroring my own, and yet neither of us dared to move. The storm outside reached a deafening intensity, waves hammering the rig in relentless rhythm, each impact vibrating through the floor beneath us. Somewhere nearby, I sensed movement that did not belong to either of us. It wasn't a sound I could clearly hear, but a presence I could feel, like a shift in pressure that made my skin prickle. My heart pounded so loudly I was convinced it would give us away, and I focused every ounce of willpower on slowing my breathing. The darkness seemed to respond, tightening around us, testing how long we could endure without breaking. Just when I thought my body would give out, the violence of the storm began to change. The impacts against the rig became less frequent, the shaking easing from violent jolts to heavy, distant tremors. The pressure in the air slowly lifted, and the sense of being watched retreated just enough for me to breathe again. I stayed frozen, afraid that relief itself might be a trick, waiting for the storm to fully release its grip. Eventually, the roar outside faded into a low, distant rumble, and the rig settled into an uneasy stillness. I remained motionless, long after the last wave struck, counting silently in my head, afraid to trust the calm. When I finally felt confident enough to move, my muscles screamed in protest, and Mark let out a shaky breath beside me that sounded dangerously loud in the quiet. The darkness no longer felt alive, just empty and cold, like a place something had passed through and left behind. I reached for the control panel and turned the lights back on, and the corridor reappeared exactly as it had been before, as if nothing had happened. The shadows clung obediently to corners again, lifeless and flat, and the rig felt like metal instead of something breathing. Mark looked at me with hollow eyes, and I knew we both understood the same thing without saying it. The rules had kept us alive, but the rig would always remember that we were here, waiting for the next storm. If you enjoyed this story, like, share, and subscribe for more.